If you've heard of the Krugersdorp cult killers or even watched Devilsdorp, then you may just be prepared for the story that I'm about to tell you. If you're not familiar with what I've just mentioned, then I urge you to brace yourself, because this tale is stranger than fiction. Hello and welcome to episode 30 of Makeup Mayhem True Crime with me, your host, Bella Monsoon. I just want to say, first of all, thank you for the major support and love that you have shown last week's video. I also received a lot of DMs and comments asking me where the makeup look went, and I unfortunately could not do a makeup tutorial last week because of ESCOM and load shedding, so the schedule did not really allow me to film for that period of time. But never fear, because today we are back with a brand new episode and a brand new makeup look. When you hear the word cult, you imagine a large group of people under the influence of a single influential leader committing the most atrocious acts of inhumanity. But what if I told you that a cult could have only 3 members and be deadly enough? With a dangerous leader at the helm, in 2008, 2 innocent lives were lost, in a sequence of events almost too bizarre to believe. If you've heard of the Krugersdorp cult killers or even watched Devilsdorp, then you may just be prepared for the story that I'm about to tell you. If you're not familiar with what I've just mentioned, then I urge you to brace yourself, because this tale is stranger than fiction. But before we get into that, for those of you who are new, let me introduce myself. I'm a mental health professional who just so happens to be obsessed with makeup, true crime, and uncovering the motives that drive people to do what they do. So basically, what this means is that every single week I post a brand new video looking at a real-life South African crime from a psychological perspective. Oh, and every alternate week, like today, I also complete a full, easy-to-follow makeup tutorial whilst discussing these cases. So, if all of that sounds like something that is right up your alley, then please do consider subscribing and joining the Ballaboo family. And if you're looking for me on other social media platforms whilst you wait for the brand new episode, or if you just want some updates and behind-the-scenes footage, then you can find me here. But if you're more a fan of podcasts, don't worry, I got you covered. I will direct you right on over to my sister podcast, Murder and Mayhem South African True Crime, available on all major streaming channels. So, just a quick disclaimer for today's episode. Today's story contains material citing murder and assault. As always, I mean no disrespect to the victims nor the extended families mentioned. The purpose of this video is to shed further light on the shocking crimes that were committed, whilst spreading awareness about the psychological nature of the narrative. This story has been thoroughly researched by myself and includes real-life accounts, video and footage where available of individuals involved directly in the case. Much of the information I have used within this episode came from a book that was written by the lawyer who was representing the Lotter siblings at the beginning of their trial, Donnie Groenlang. Due to much legislature and politics, he ended up not being able to continue representing the siblings, although he still wanted to help. The accounts mentioned, therefore, are basically first-person narrative given to Donnie by the individuals themselves. At points, the story may seem incredibly unreal, but I assure you that everything I'm about to tell you is 100% true. To our knowledge, of course. Due to the very different nature of this episode, I'm going to be telling it in a very different way. In order to understand what happened, and more importantly, why and how it happened, there are some key concepts that you need to be aware of. But before we delve into the why, let's explore the who, and the moments that led up to the crimes that made headlines. To start off, let's meet the Lotter family and learn more about who they are. The Lotter family can be traced back to the Boer folk, who played major roles in the Boer War with the British imperialists. But that's a story for another day or a history lesson. So we're just going to start with Marie. Marie Bokkie Cornelius, nicknamed as such because when she was excited, she would jump up and down like a bokkie, which is a gazelle that is native to South Africa. She ended up marrying a man named Piet van der Merwe, and they went on to have 4 children. Her only daughter, named Maria Magdalena Hendriana van der Merwe. Yeah, I know it's a mouthful. Much later on in her life, Borky would go on to be diagnosed with schizophrenia. This seemingly unrelated fact is important for much later. Maria, her daughter, who was nicknamed and known to many as Ricky, would go on to study at university and become an Afrikaans schoolteacher. She went on to marry Johannes Petrus Hardus later. The couple had met as they were both studying at the same university, and shortly after they married, they went on to have their first child. The baby girl was christened Nicolette Lotte and was born on April 15th, 1982. However, in her early life, her parents were relatively absent as they were both juggling studying as well as working, and so from the age of around 9 months, she spent most of her time in creche during the day. When they did have the time though, the family would get together, they would have fun, and they would play music. This is also where her love and passion for music would begin. The family then moved to the Transkei after Johannes graduated with a diploma in accounts management. And it was here in 1986 that Christelle was born, and in 1988, Hardus, their last child, was born. Soon after his birth, the family moved to Westville in Durban, after Johannes was recruited by a big company. The family, who up until this point had just lived in landlocked farms, welcomed the idea of being near the beautiful Indian Ocean. And it was here in Westville that they would raise their 3 children. And it was also here that they would meet their demise. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The family was deeply religious, with one of Maria's and one of Johannes's brothers each becoming a pastor and a preacher. Weekly meetings, Bible study, Sunday school, church choir, and home prayer groups surrounded the Lotte children as they grew up. And as a young girl, Nicolette would often spend time with her grandmother Borky, remember her, whilst on holiday. It is here that she would learn about all the African spirits, the Tokoloshi being the center of the narrative. And this was all before she was even 8 years old. Nicolette grew up with an avid, fantasy-filled mind. Although she didn't receive much attention from her mother in her early years, her siblings, Christelle and Hardus, benefited from more attention from Ricky, as she had later on quit her job in order to raise her children. Nicolette, or Nikki as she was affectionately known, and how I will refer to her in the remainder of this narrative, didn't really mind that much, and she ended up growing quite close to her father. She would often accompany him on his fishing trips, which he loved doing, and it was there that she learned the tricks of the trade. Around the age of 13, though, she decided in typical teen fashion that it was time to not spend her weekends on fishing trips, but instead she wanted to meet boys and hang out with her friends. Although sad, her father realized that his little girl was growing up, and he allowed her the space to do so. So I think it's also pertinent to mention here that the Lotte family held many norms or ways of life that are typical of a conservative nuclear Afrikaans family. This included the patriarchal rules of the family, as well as the intense privacy that surrounded each member of the family, to the extent that the children were raised with the allowance of keeping their doors closed or even locked. Other family members would have to knock and wait before entering. This small detail may not seem relevant at all now, but it has a major role to play later on in this narrative. So Nikki is growing up, experimenting with boys, and just after her teens, she has her first sexual encounter. So there are obviously a lot of changes going on, and Nikki discovers a lipstick smudged cigarette as well as a Spider-Man figurine in her father's car, and it's later discovered that these belong to his secretary. One thing leads to another, and after telling her mother, Ricky then confronts her husband in front of her children. Nikki is 15 years old at the time, Hardus is 10 years old, and Christelle is 13. All of the children would later note that this was a pivotal changing moment in their lives. A moment in which they saw the strong father figure that they had come to know and love crumble and beg for forgiveness from his wife. From this point on, things are just never really the same again for anyone in the family. Nikki, now as a young woman, is searching, like many others her age, for meaning in her life, and in particular, a deep religious experience that will give her the approval that she feels is lacking from her parents. She also happens to be the most religious and the most superstitious one in the family, and I don't doubt that her grandmother, Boki, had a role to play in this. She believed fully in the stories she was told about the evil spirits, the Tokoloshi, and the role of the Inyangas and Sangomas, African traditional healers. For a quick catch-up or 101 for my non-South Africans, the Tokoloshi is an evil imp-like spirit that terrorizes the lives of families, particularly in rural African villages and locations. I actually cover the full history of the Tokoloshi myth and legend in this video if you're interested in learning more. As the children enter their teen and adult years, Hardus grows into a quiet but diligent young man, spending more time with his computer and his gadgets than anything else. As opposed to his more social sister Nikki, he does not have a big friend group and he's never had a girlfriend. But what the two do have in common is that they are both deeply religious and they both suffer from quite a low self-image and self-esteem. From this point on, I'm not really going to speak about Christelle as she doesn't really have any place or role in this narrative. She left the Lotte home after finishing school and she went on to study at Stellenbosch University. Although she encountered her own spiritual battles along the way, particularly with navigating life as part of the shofar movement she joined, it does not impact the story that is to be told. So whilst in her teenage years, Nikki is diagnosed with anorexia nervosa, the eating disorder. One that is then fueled by her religious fasting habits as well as her innate need for control. Along with this diagnosis, Nikki also suffers from an extremely low self-image and self-esteem, both of which are just exacerbated by the physical interactions she has with boys during this time. She seemed to just be attracting and engaging with boys that would just use her for a good time and then dispose of her. This also created a very warped view in her mind of what love means. She later, at only 15 years old, ends up getting unknowingly involved with a friend of hers in an unsolicited adult photo shoot, amongst other things. And this experience would ultimately go on to haunt her for years to come. With mental distress forming a major part of her life, Nikki is not in a good frame of mind. However, she does have her music, and that is something she excels at and truly loves, a passion that she developed as a child. She goes on to study a music and jazz course at the Durban Institute of Technology, and it is here that she meets a whole new group of friends. She decides to give her life back to God and she becomes a born-again Christian, far more religious than she has ever been before. But this transition, really giving up parties, boys, drinking, and more, is not an easy one. And to add insult to injury, the nursemaid who has looked after her since childhood, Amma, passes away from old age. Nikki is now 21 years old, and her fixation with religion, as well as battling her own demons, is at its peak. And in 2001, a woman named Clementia Ntomi fills the job that Amma left behind. And this is where the trouble begins. So I'm now going to take a break from the Lotte family and I'm going to introduce you to the Naidoo family. Well, at least to Mathew, that is. Mathew Naidoo was born in 1986 in Durban, KwaZulu-Natal, and grew up as an only child. His father left the family when he was only 2 years old. Growing up, he didn't excel in school, and very early on, he was diagnosed as being dyslexic. Teachers soon remarked, however, that he was also incredibly lazy, and this was a trait that would only increase in the years to come. Soon after finishing school and with not many options, he began to work in his uncle's factory shop, packing boxes for about 290 rand a week. At this point, he had grown into a very tall, fleshy man of over 100 kgs who was quite strong. He was unfortunately also quite spoilt. Even with his mom's meager earnings as a seamstress, he managed to always get his way and control everyone around him. His mother, who was later questioned about his pathological lies, would go on to say, "A lot of children tell lies. Maybe he thought he was protecting me. He deserves another chance." Honestly, I'm sure he considered this his special gift. His ability to get people to do whatever he wanted. Ironically, throughout all this time whilst he was working, he would seek advice on how to be a man of God from his friend and next-door neighbor, Reverend Pillay. Reverend Pillay was pretty much double Mathew's age, but he was the father figure that Mathew needed. Reverend Pillay also happened to be the husband of Venla, who will enter this narrative very shortly. And so in 2007, Mathew was 20 years old and he was living in Phoenix with his family. Right, so we are back to the Lotta family, and if you will remember, I had mentioned that Clementia had just started working for the family. It also just so happened that her son was a Sangoma. From the moment she arrived, Nikki and her did not get along, and very soon Nikki was convinced that she had cursed the family. And so Nikki began to accuse her of witchcraft, and as you can imagine, the situation escalated quite quickly. Obviously, Clementia was not impressed with these accusations, and so began a cat-mouse game of torment. Clementia soon realized that Nikki was quite superstitious, and so she would place dead frogs or anything she could find under Nikki's windowsill or in places that she knew Nikki would find them. Nikki in turn changed her habits and her routines, washing all of her laundry in her own private bathroom and not eating any meals that Clementia had a hand in making. Her complaints to her parents, however, fell upon deaf ears. So at this stage, Christelle, her sister, was studying in Stellenbosch, and Hardus was just not the kind of person for confrontation. Nikki's delusions became so bad that one day she doused the walls in motor oil after mistakenly reading Castrol multigrade as multigrade. Muti means medicine, particularly to protect, prevent, and treat ailments, and is deeply related to the realm of witchcraft and traditional healing. She was also fasting often and not eating any food that was prepared at home, and so as a result she was losing hair, which is to be expected and quite normal given the circumstances. However, instead of attributing that to her current lifestyle, she blamed it on black magic. And of course, Clementia. She then started to claim that at night she was being plagued by evil spirits and she was being raped by the Tokoloshi. I mention this because it was this turmoil that led her to seek help. And it was through the help that she sought that she met the individual who changed her entire life trajectory. So Nikki began to go from church to church, seeking help or an exorcism to rid her of these evil spirits. No one was able to, or rather wanted to, get involved. Until when at a service of the umpteenth church, the Pentecostal church in Phoenix, she is approached by a woman who has heard her dilemma and knows someone who can help. And so it is here on the 11th of February 2007 that Nikki visits Venla and her daughter Claudette, the exorcists of Phoenix, or at least two of them. This duo would give Nikki the thing she has been longing for the most: validation. Unfortunately, they see her vulnerable state of mind and they take full advantage of it. Now, I'm not speaking against the belief that dark spirits may very well exist, but in this case, Mama Venla and Claudette shamelessly exploited the rich white girl from Westville. Before any exorcism can take place, Nikki is told that she needs to purchase certain food items in order to placate the evil spirits. And it is required that she drives the duo to the shops and pays for their groceries. Essential exorcism items. And with that purchase all done, the exorcism begins. Wendla begins to wave her arms in the air, cleansing Nikki's aura, whilst Claudette sits on the corner of the bed smoking a cigarette. She soon, however, puts out her cigarette, and not but a moment later begins convulsing and growling and thrashing about. Nikki is shocked, but Wendla convinces her that this is just how the dark spirits show themselves, and not to worry because Claudette is protected by her. To ward off these evil spirits, Wendla then shakes a charm bracelet at Claudette. And all of a sudden, she is back, looking around, confused, asking her mother what has happened. Surely if this is a regular occurrence, she would realize by now what is going on. Nikki, however, is impressed by the power that Wendla has to control the dark spirits, and probably as a result of psychosomatic suggestion, she is sold. Wendla, obviously milking the situation, says yes, she will be able to cleanse Nikki's life and home, but the process itself will be a very long and expensive one. Nikki, exuberant that someone is actually willing to help her, agrees. She will rid herself and her family of the black magic and evil spirits, no matter what the cost. The following week, Wendla visits Nikki's home on the Wednesday, and that Saturday evening, Nikki spends the night at Wendla in Phoenix. And it is here that she meets Mathew, Naidoo. So, you know how some couples meet on Tinder or in a club? Well, Mathew had heard about Nikki, the white, blonde girl from Westville with an evil spirits problem, from his friend and father figure, Reverend Play. And let's just say I'm sure the ensuing conversations about Nikki were less than savory. And so that Saturday night, he uninvitedly showed up with a bouquet of dusty plastic flowers, walked straight into the house, into the room where Nikki was sitting on the couch, got down on his knees and said to her, "You are beautiful. I love you. Please will you marry me?" Excuse me? Rando say what? Yeah, so that doesn't really go as planned, as Nikki swats the flowers away and objects to this person that she has never ever seen or met before. Her first thoughts about him, as later revealed in court, was that he was loud, irritating, and attention-seeking. Mathew, having set his eyes on a new target, refuses to be discouraged, and throughout the night he continues to attempt to engage her in conversation, make her laugh, and impress her with his biblical knowledge. And you know what? His persistence proves successful, as she goes to sleep that night thinking about this brazen, brash man who approached her in a way that no man has ever approached her before. At this point, too, she has not been with another man in years, as she had chosen to remain celibate to show her dedication to God. The next day, as she arrives home, she receives a text message from an unknown number. You guessed it, it's Mathew. The message reads, "Hi Nikki, it's Mathew. I hope you made it home safe. I was worried for you. I miss you. Please come back soon." Right, so immediately there should be red flags because, this guy just met you and he already misses you. Not to mention the way that he met you to begin with. But anyway, Nikki overlooks all of this because she's just honestly happy that someone cares. And after speaking back and forth in text messages the entire week, she is back in Phoenix that weekend, and they meet once again face to face in Wimpy. Mathew then proceeds to tell Nikki that not only is he a man of God, but that he wishes to become a messianic prophet and a healer of the afflicted. Nikki is over the moon, and it is here that the love bombing truly begins. And it is also here that I'm going to start explaining this narrative in a different way. In a way that will make the events that occurred make a lot more sense. So love bombing is characterized by excessive attention, admiration, and affection, with the ultimate goal to make the recipient feel special, needed, and loved. It is also a vital component in the transition into a cult. Now, before we go any further, I'm pretty sure that you've heard of cults before. But did you know that not every single cult is bad? A cult is defined as any system of devotion to a person or an idea, and can take the form of a church or a sect. I mean, in this respect, a cult could even be a group of people who religiously follow Chloe Ting workouts and swear that she is the best fitness guru out there. A cult, regardless of their goals or missions, often have several dimensions in common though. The first is a charismatic leader. In the case of cults that are not the greatest, this leader would also tend to be a master manipulator. This would be Mathew, the persistent man whom Nikki has just met. Leaders are able to read people and find things in common in order to draw them in. In this case, Mathew has found common ground, religion, and now all he has to do is focus his attention on building that connection. And it is often those with a lower self-esteem or those who are searching for something more that tend to be an easy target for a cult leader. Nikki is one such individual. She is going through emotional turmoil, and all she is seeking is someone to validate her experience. Love bombing is therefore used here to create the perception that further interactions with this individual, Mathew, will give Nikki everything that she so badly desires. Chemically, the recipient gets a boost of dopamine and endorphins, and so this creates a positive reinforcement model, where receiving this love becomes a necessity. The two of them have only just met, but the connection has already begun. Unfortunately for Mathew, Mr. and Mrs. Lotta are part of a generation or era that is not entirely open or rather exuberant about racial mixing, especially at least when it comes to their children's partners. After an argument between mother and daughter one night about the state of her room or something along those lines, Nikki mentions that, fine, I'll go stay with my boyfriend. Immediately after hearing more about him as well as where he lives, Nikki's parents call out Mathew as a very racist term for an Indian person. And honestly, they were initially horrified that their precious daughter was fraternizing with an Indian man. Mathew, however, then spoke to Mrs. Lotta over the phone and he calmed her down, much to Nikki's surprise. So, although initially she had rejected his physical advances, after he comes to her rescue, they sleep together in the back of her car. He convinces her that God is with them and has blessed the union. It's also Mathew's first time, and for him, this is a victory in more than one way. They then enter the next phase of what will be a disastrous connection. After this initial physical connection, Mathew declares that Nikki is his soulmate and proposes marriage, yet again. But this time, Nikki accepts. Yeah, this is only after probably less than a month of knowing him. Mathew's love bombing is clearly working. So this prospective husband has yet to meet Nikki's family. In person though. And so the day eventually comes, Hardus's 19th birthday. Hardus ends up getting along great with Mathew, connecting over their shared interest of Samurai Jack and WrestleMania. But unfortunately, the Lotta parents are less than impressed with Mathew. Although they feign politeness, their real feelings about the situation are more than obvious, especially to Mathew. And that spells trouble. The following Monday morning, Mrs. Lotta approaches her daughter and suggests that perhaps she needs to see a psychiatrist. Why, you may ask? Well, the Lotta parents were worried that Nikki may be schizophrenic, much like Borky, her grandmother. Schizophrenia does have a big genetic component, and multiple studies have discovered that there is a significant heritability factor. It is interesting to note that all the bizarre behavior that Nikki displayed in the previous month did not warrant concern. However, it was the addition of this Indian boyfriend that finally persuaded her parents to question her sanity. So now that Mathew has a hold on Nikki that is ever growing, he announces to her that he is a prophet, healer, and God's messenger. In many cases, religion is the main factor that leads many to a cult, as the leader will often claim that they are sent by God. Or in Mathew's case, he would later announce himself as the Son of God. This is done in order to legitimize what the individual is saying and make the narrative all that more convincing. Mathew then goes on to say that all of the trauma of his father leaving at the age of 2 years old caused him to develop multiple personalities, which was confirmed at that stage by a psychiatrist. I mean, at 2 years old. So he was actually Mathew, the human him, Matthias, the wise old man part of him, and Mathane, the naughty, rebellious side of him. And you know what? This lie was just the tip of a very big, Titanic-sized iceberg. As the relationship progresses, Mathew also has moments where he speaks in the different voices of the individuals he channels. Now, if you remember the Krugersdorp cult killer case, which I will link up above in case you want to check it out, this was also something that Cecilia Stain did. Mathew was a formidable cult leader in training, possessing many traits of narcissism, and later in court, he was outright called a pathological liar. He would, however, continue to speak this brainwashing narrative to Nikki and later Hardus, convincing the siblings that his version of events was reality. On Mrs. Lotter's 50th birthday, she decides to give Mathew another chance, seeing as Nikki appears to be doing so much better after she met him. And so he is invited and attends her birthday bash. And then, after the party, Nikki proceeds to sneak Mathew into her room to spend the night. But Christelle, who is visiting from Stellenbosch, spots the duo and tells Mrs. Lotter, who is less than impressed. Mathew, when confronted, of course has a story, and he proceeds to tell Mrs. Lotter how he was raped the previous year when he was studying at UNISA. He uses this fake narrative to back up his new story on how he's not into anything that's sexual, which is the furthest thing from the truth, and also how he is so drawn to Nikki because she is such an amazing woman of God. And like so many before her, Mrs. Lotter believes his story. And so Mathew's confidence grows. Mathew continues to build up his relationship with Nikki, spending much time with her and showering her with affection and love. That is, of course, until the couple bump into Nikki's ex-boyfriend from high school, JP, while they are walking in Gateway Shopping Center. Although she was kissing and walking hand in hand with Mathew, after seeing JP, she pulls away slightly and drops her hand. And this is enough to set off what will be the first of many physical encounters. After a fiery argument and whilst driving him home, Mathew begins to slap Nikki across the face. Shocked, she immediately screams at him to get out of the car, which he did, and she drives away. And at this point, one would hope that she drove away and never looked back. Well, no, not exactly. She did drive a few kilometers, but then she became worried that something would happen to him if she just left him there on the side of the road. And so she turned around. She then drove back and she apologized. He swore at her. She begged for forgiveness. And then he called her a whore and told her that he did not need her. And then he promptly got back into the car so that he could get a lift home. He then stated quite nonchalantly to her something along the lines of, "I wanted to leave you, but you're lucky. my angel said that you're important to God. Nikki feels a flood of relief, and just like that, Mathew has turned the table. And like any successful cult leader, he has created a dependency for affection and acceptance from Nikki. And this will be just the beginning of the toxic affair. So after that first lovers' spat, Nikki and Mathew are back to their version of normality. Mathew, however, is hiding, amongst other things, a resentment for all that Nikki and her family has and all that he and his family does not. He would later state in a letter that he wrote to God, "Do I have to take that cash from my mother? I can't stand her anymore, let alone take her money. And as for her brother and sisters, they are like shit to me. The men in my family are lusting over my wife and just want to use her for sex. They just want to use my wife because she's white, and the women all hate me for no reason." And so Mathew devises a plan. He begins to complain in front of Nikki about how poor he is. Keep in mind that up until this point, all of the expenses, the food, the entertainment, etc., have all been on Nikki. Mathew has not contributed much, if anything at all, financially to the relationship. During this time, Nikki, who is now 25 years old, has started a band, Kula, and they are quite popular, booking paid gigs and playing shows all around KZN. She is also waitressing at a restaurant called Firkins. She then decides that it'll be a great idea for Mathew, without any experience, to come and work as the band manager so that he can earn more money. To Mathew, the money part sounds great. The work part, not so much. However, on the 18th of May 2007, he agrees, and he leaves his job as a packer. He then goes on to complain that the job is all good and dandy, but he is going to have to ask her for money all the time. She then hands him all of her bank cards, and she leaves him in control of all the finances. In her eyes, and as far as she is aware, in his eyes, they are basically married. And she knows that traditionally the men are in charge of finances and those kinds of affairs in the home. And so in one foul swoop, Mathew now not only has control of Nikki, but also her finances. And this is yet another integral step in building loyalty within a cult following. It is all about gaining maximum control. Oh, and did I mention that during this time, Mathew is also living on and off in Nikki's bedroom, unbeknownst to the lot of parents. And because of that locked door policy that I mentioned earlier, the two are able to pull it off, with Mathew only entering the house after the parents have gone to sleep. Hardus notices after a while, but he likes Mathew and he views him as a brother, so he decides to keep their secret. Within weeks of being together, the abuse escalates from Mathew slapping Nikki to unspeakable aggressive violations in the bedroom, which I will not get into. He also often punishes her for disobeying him by urinating on her and in her mouth. He was an absolute master at mind control, utilizing many common techniques, such as public humiliation, constantly reminding Nikki of her past indiscretions, especially in front of Hardus. The goal was to maintain emotional control over her. And in case he didn't seem like enough of a great guy as it was, he also hated animals. Nikki had a cat which she had had from a kitten named Rambo, whom she absolutely loved, and she had this cat prior to meeting Mathew. Shortly after he comes to stay, the cat is found dead in the next door neighbor's yard. When asked about it, he blames Mathew, his dark side. The old family dog is also later targeted, but thankfully survives that physical encounter. Nikki is too preoccupied at this stage with Mathew's dark mood swings to even grieve the loss of her pet. Focusing on male happiness was unfortunately a learned behavior for Nikki, as she grew up in a household where the patriarchy was strong. So that, in combination with the grooming techniques that Mathew had been utilizing, left her very much further under his control and influence. And the more control Mathew has, the more Nikki's life begins to suffer. She is working extremely long hours, only to come home so that she can pray over, or rather sexually please Mathew. She barely gets any sleep too, as he pretty much takes up the entire single bed, leaving her to sleep on the floor in her own room. He also then orders her to cut her hair, which she absolutely loves, and he tells her to throw out all of her whore clothing. He even dictates what music she can listen to. The rest must be disposed of. These actions further serve to destroy her personal identity for a more favored group identity, whilst further isolating her from the things that she is familiar with. And Mathew's role as the manager of their band leads to further chaos. He ends up getting them kicked out or cancelled from multiple gigs due to trying to hustle ridiculous price increases, or in another case, getting on stage to tell crude jokes in between their performances. He then convinces Nikki that he needs to be in her room 24/7 in order to protect her from the evil spirits and the Tokoloshi. He also then goes on to tell her that he knows that the Tokoloshi and the spirits who torment her at night have been sent by her father. And the reason he knows this? Well, it's because he is the Son of God. He then solidifies this narrative by confirming that they are destined to have children together, 3 children in fact. One of them has the name Sasha, which she has always dreamed about, but never told anyone, besides her journal that is. And Mathew just so happens to know it. Talk about divine perception, or rather a case of snooping fingers. I mean, and these are not even the most ridiculous things he says. He now knows that Nikki is firmly under his control, and so he sets his sights on Hardus. His ultimate plan requires both siblings. Hardus is quiet and reserved, but he connects with his sister's boyfriend, and he's eager to please, in this case, his sister. He's also part of the new South Africa, so he doesn't really get the race issue that the Lotta parents have with Mathew. Mathew then begins to exploit him and exert control over him, using the same methods and formula that he used with Nikki. The initial story is that Mathew is recruiting God's warriors, the 12 Knights of God, and Hardus will be one of them. And with Hardus slowly slipping under his control, the cult is truly in action. Over the weeks to follow, he would constantly speak a narrative to the siblings until they became to believe his version of events as real life. 2 of these stories were that their parents had raped them as children, but God had helped them to forget and block out the memory. And the other was that their parents were responsible for apartheid lasting so long. The brainwashing was working. On the 22nd of September 2007, Mathew turned 21. By this time, both of the Lotta siblings are well under his control, giving him whatever income they make or receive and obeying his will, as he is the divine messenger of God, God's own son, to be precise. Mathew's relationship with Nikki is as toxic as ever, and his controlling and jealous behavior ends up getting her fired from her waitressing gig at Firkins. With income drying up, Mathew begins brainstorming again. And that's when it comes to him. No, not the realization that he should get a job, but rather the Lotta parents need to die. Mathew has told them that this all must go down at 8 p.m. At first she thinks that this is just some sort of prank like friendly wrestling, but then he pulls her out of his chair and they both fall to the floor. Mr. Lotta is next.